Well, hey everybody, Jonathan Doyle with you once again. Thanks so much for tuning into the Supply Side Podcast. Really great to have the pleasure of your company. Today, my friends, we are going a little further down the rabbit hole, a little deeper into the parallel universe that is MMT, Modern Monetary Theory, or as Jim Rogers likes to call it, more money today. Yes, indeed, this is a Supply Side Podcast. This is where we focus on the basic supply side ideas that when men and women produce useful goods and services that people actually want, then economies and societies can flourish, which is a little different to the world we are inhabiting right now, where I think we are currently a little north of around 22 trillion of excess global liquidity since the start of the COVID pandemic. And that is washing around global asset markets, and it's finding a home and creating the everything bubble. So what we're doing here is I wanted to understand MMT. As regular listeners know, I came into this whole space of global macro finance and economic history, political economy. I came into it very, very late. It was one of the few blessings of COVID is that I started to get an interest in this area. So I'm sure many of you listening will have had long and extensive careers professionally, academically in these areas. I have not. So I have a curiosity that hopefully is a little refreshing for people. And I wanted to understand MMT. I sort of began to understand the kind of resets of the global monetary systems that seem to take place every 70 to 80 years, and really noticing that MMT is it's really what's happening, isn't it? It's basically, I mean, if you go back to my first video on this, I was talking about how a lot of MMT advocates talk about its descriptive power, which I said was a little bit of sophistry, because they sort of pretend that that's all it is. And it's much more than that, but I think it is fair to say that it is descriptive. MMT is describing what is actually happening. And so I wanted to understand it better. I thought it was really important that we got to terms with this. We got to got to grips with what MMT advocates really believe, and I think we should be able to critique it, and if it's wrong, we should be able to poke plenty of holes in it. So wherever you're hearing this, I'd love you to post some comments if you're seeing the YouTube version or if you're on the website here at supplysidepartners.com. I'd love it if you could post your thoughts and insights into this MMT journey. So now we're into chapter 1. So I've done the first overarching video podcast where I talked about the general flow of Stephanie Kelton's book, The Deficit Myth. So, of course, Stephanie Kelton is the most widely known global advocate of MMT. And so I'm working forensically through her book. And so we're into chapter 1. So chapter 1 is, and the flow of her book is to present a myth and then to present what she calls reality. So she presents a myth that, probably supply-siders or the general public thinks. And here's a good thing about the general public, they often get it right. I often say if you can get a 5-year-old or the general public to see the basic truth of something, you're probably onto something important. So I guess Stephanie Kelton would argue that there is a myth that the majority of us out there in political economy land believe, and she and other MMT advocates are here to disabuse us, disavow us of our foolishness and show us the truth in our blindness. So here's the first one. This is chapter 1. So the whole framing of this chapter is about the idea of that we must no longer think of government fiscal policy as having anything to do with a household budget. So, of course, all of us who have personal finances, which we all do, and some of us have children and families, and we know the broad reality that you cannot consume more than you produce. You can't spend more than you earn or save. Eventually, there comes a reckoning at some point. I'm not talking about strategic leverage here and using debt, strategically. I'm talking about this basic idea that budgets must balance. Dr. Kelton makes the point that politicians actually love this rhetoric, and she also says that they really don't know better, that a lot of politicians still approach government finances in the same way as a household budget. But it's and I think she does make a good point here, that it is very easy for politicians to point to fiscal deficits and attack their opponents by saying the budget's not balanced, and to pitch that household budget mentality to the general public. I think that is a valid point, that it's a very easy message to sell if you're a politician, to go, look at the profligate spending over here. If we were in power, we would balance it like a household budget. So this is where MMT begins its point of departure. And she basically says that we have to understand that government finances bear zero relation to household finances. So this is where she wants to correct the myth, that she believes in this idea that there is a vast difference between currency issuers and currency users, and these are the terms she used. So here's a direct quote. She says, "Only the federal government can issue currency. Everyone else is merely a currency user." And this is, if you're eating your cornflakes, you may be about to choke on them. She says, "It's a special power that must be exercised with great care." Yes, of course it is. And I think most of us would agree that it's not exactly a power that is currently being exercised with great care by the political class. And just on that, I'm due next week to interview the wonderful Sam Gregg, who's the research director at the Acton Institute. And he had a quote yesterday. I was reading one of his articles on public discourse, and he quotes Alexander Hamilton, 1795, who said that debt accumulation was perhaps the natural disease of all governments. Amen to that. So I like how Dr. Kelton here says that this special power of being a currency issuer must be exercised with great care. Yes, I think we could probably critique the veracity of that statement, but this is a core principle, that if governments can issue currency, they are in a fundamentally different class of reality than the rest of us. And here is another really important quote. This is from page 18, and you want to hear this one. She says, "The distinction between currency users and the currency issuer lies at the heart of MMT." Right, that's her word. So if you want to understand the core of MMT, you have to understand this distinction between the currency issuer and the rest of us great unwashed who are merely currency users. She also then talks a little bit about the concept of monetary sovereignty, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. So the basic principle that if a government prints and borrows in its own currency, and wait for it, she argues that the government no longer needs to balance its budget, it just needs to pursue full employment. Drum roll, please. Bum, bum, bum. That's a big statement. Many of you, of course, familiar that the Federal Reserve's dual mandate to create stable prices and to pursue full employment. So what MMT is saying is that, you know what, it totally doesn't matter if budgets balance at all. All that actually matters is the stability of the real economy, whatever that is taken to mean. Chris DeMuth, I read one of his articles recently, and in terms of, he's a political historian, he made the point that for 181 years, US government basically balanced its budget, right? For almost 181 years. It was small ups and downs, but nothing like we're seeing now. 181 years until the significant change. All right, so let's press on. The next part that Dr. Stephanie Kelton talks about in Chapter 1 is she quotes an important speech by British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher back in 1983. And here's the quote from Thatcher. Margaret Thatcher says in this speech, I quote, "The state has no source of money other than the money people earn themselves. If the state wishes to spend more, it can only do so by borrowing your savings or taxing more." So there is that idea that most of us would have grown up with, that the government doesn't have any money except the money that it takes from us. Interesting that I just got a copy of Dominic Frisby's book on tax called Daylight Robbery. Daylight Robbery. That the government has no money except for the money it steals. Sorry, the money it raises from the general polis. So this is where MMT goes further down its path of, radical departure. Page 23, Dr. Kelton says, the government doesn't need our money. We need their money. We've got the whole thing backward. This is MMT. This is pure MMT, right? One more time, page 23. The government doesn't need our money. We need their money. We've got the whole thing backwards. So then she introduces this difference between tabs and stabs. I'm not sure if you've heard of this before, but if you haven't, tabs is what Thatcher's talking about. Tab stands for, the T is for tax, the A is for and the B is for borrow. So the government taxes and borrows via bond issuing and then spends. That's tabs, tax and borrows and spends. MMT argues that it's completely backwards, that the truth is that what happens first is stabs. The government spends first, it taxes and borrows and then spends again into the economy, but it's spending first. So it's not raising revenue first, it's pumping money into the economy first, and then it taxes and borrows. And this is where, I kind of did feel I'd fallen into a parallel universe, because where this kind of goes in terms of, the obvious questions, why tax at all? Why have bond issuing at all if you can just permanently, spend into the economy? We'll get to that very soon. So the next thing we have here is she talks about her encounter with Warren Mosler, who's seen as the father of MMT. So Mosler was a trader. He was, independently wealthy as a Wall Street guy, and after many years of just, watching transactions happen, apparently he asked himself one day, where does the money come from? So he would see money, huge sums of money moving in and out of accounts, and he was curious about where those very first dollars had come from. So Mosler's thesis is that the government doesn't need our money because it creates it and spends it. So the obvious question, apparently Stephanie Kelton went down to Florida to meet him, and she asked the obvious question. She said, well, if they don't need our money, then why tax us at all? Why, what's the whole system based on? So Mosler's great statement was that the government doesn't need our money, and Kelton says, well, what does it need? And it says it needs us to provision it. What the government needs the reason it creates taxes is to force us to work to provision itself. So by forcing us to have to go to work to get its currency, which we then pay it back in taxes, we actually go and do things in the real economy. We get jobs as doctors, nurses, maintenance people. And so he argues that what the government actually needs isn't our money. What the government actually needs is our labour. It needs a military, it needs a court system, it needs national park workers. So by creating currency and then taxing it back off us, it forces us to work to keep itself running. And in the first video I said this is, it's really kind of a hive mentality. It's a very utilitarian construct of what it means to be human and the importance of work. So that is Mosler's kind of departure, and Mosler gives her an example. He talked about having his kids at home in Florida, and the house was getting messy, and that he wanted the kids to start cleaning up the house. And they're like, yeah, we'll get to it. He even offered to pay them, and they're like, yeah, we'll get to it. So he said to them one day, he tried an experiment. He printed up a bunch of his own business cards, not money, just his own business cards. And he said to his kids, hey, I am going to give you 10 of my business cards if you do these chores. Mow the lawn, wash the cars, do the dishes, tidy up your bedrooms. If you do that, I'm going to give you 10 of my business cards. And they're like, we don't want your stupid business cards. We're not doing the work. So, they're like, why would we want your business cards? So then he comes up with this other idea. He says to them, you know what? Here's what's going to happen. At the end of, I'm going to give you a whole bunch of these cards and you're going to work. And if you don't give these back to me at the end of the month, then you're going to lose all your privileges. You don't get TV, you don't get to go to the mall, you don't get to do X and X and X. And all of a sudden the kids started working rapidly and to give him back these cards, because once he got his cards back, they were free to go and do whatever they want. So he realized that in an instant, his business cards, his paper currency that he printed, suddenly became valuable because his children needed those cards to get their privileges back. So the example was that's kind of what MMT is saying about tax dollars, is that, the fiat currency is utterly worthless. It's paper. So where does its value come from? MMT would say, well, you need that paper fiat currency to be able to avoid punishment, avoid going to prison. And so the government uses it to force us to work. Interesting. So what else did he have to say here? Taxes exist, according to MMT, to create a demand for government currency. Taxes exist to create a demand for government currency. That's just mind-bending, isn't it? It's like we think of taxes as, we're working and producing, and then the government creates taxes to steal the money off us to do all these things that it needs to do. But this MMT paradigm is that, the government's using that system to provision itself and forcing us to work to keep itself going. She says here, once you're able to see that the government's ability to spend doesn't revolve around the taxpayer dollar, the whole fiscal paradigm shifts. So once again, she says, once you're able to see that the government ability to spend doesn't revolve around the taxpayer dollar, the whole fiscal paradigm shifts. So I'd be interested in your thoughts on that. It's a genuine paradigm shift, because we all grow up thinking that, government's ability to spend is based on how much tax revenue it raises. But, the MMT people are just like going, no, irrelevant. The taxes have nothing to do with what the government can spend. The taxes just exist to make us work. All right, so it leads to the obvious question, why have taxes in MMT at all? And so here they are. She lists 4 reasons. Number 1, taxes enable governments to provision themselves without the use of explicit force. It's just, don't you sense a certain kind of malevolence in that? And some people go, well, this is the nature of, I guess the sociological compact that holds cultures together, that instead of forcing us into slave labor, the government uses this system of taxation to make us do what it would otherwise have to force us to do. So taxes enable governments to provision themselves without the use of explicit force. Number 2, taxes exist to restrain inflation by taking currency away. So she wrote a few paragraphs on this. Basically, I think she's arguing that if the government just kept spending more and more and more and more currency into various projects, it would be inflationary. So by taxing us, they get to pull money out, or pull currency out of the real economy so they can target it elsewhere. So it's a way of subtracting dollars out of the economy. Number 3, wealth redistribution. Taxes exist for wealth redistribution, as we will find. That is a great love of the MMT people. They are here to help us, friends. They're here to save us. They're here to... are they all social justice warriors? No, but there is a strong sense that that we need to use fiscal and monetary policy, fiscal policy definitely, to take wealth away, to redistribute it. Of course, who gets to decide about that redistribution? So there's a strong soak the rich vein through her writing, but she argues that we need to soak the rich for redistributive reasons. She doesn't think that soaking the rich is actually going to help in a fiscal sense. It's just good to spread the love around by taking it off those that have so much. Now, I picked up something here reading this. She argues that one of the reasons we need to use tax for wealth distribution, in her words, she says, because inequality has never been higher. So this is at the time of her writing it. Now, help me if I'm wrong here, but we've been running Keynesianism for, really since Bretton Woods, right? So if inequality's never been higher, we've been running these kind of profligate MMT-style approaches. So surely if Keynesianism and MMT was the way to go, why is inequality worse? And basically she's advocating for more Keynesianism, more MMT. I got lost on that part. So anyway, I'll be interested in your thoughts on that. And finally, why do we have taxes? To encourage or discourage certain behaviors. Interesting. And I said in the first video, who gets to decide which behaviors need to be encouraged or discouraged? I am a lover of American whiskey. I just think bourbon is one of the greatest things God ever did. And I also love smoking a pipe. I don't smoke it a lot, but I do have it. And I don't need anybody to tell me that those behaviors should be discouraged. It's, this is a basic libertarian principle, right? Like, I guess there's got to be boundaries, there's got to be some parameters, but when taxation is used to encourage or discourage certain behaviors, the real question is who gets to make the decisions about that. Okay, almost done. So the last couple of things here is, the obvious question is, then what are the limits here? Why not just print and spend indefinitely, which kind of looks like what's happening at the moment anyway? But this is the MMT thesis, is that the real limit on spending is not the productive economy as such. The real limit on spending isn't on taxation or anything else. The real limit on spending is all about inflation. So the MMT people have this fixation with inflation, and they want to tell us that they're deadly serious about not being profligate spenders because their real focus is on inflation. So here she says, this is a direct quote from Stephanie Kelton, MMT is not about removing all limits. It's not a free lunch. I don't know if you've seen the CARES Act. I think you might disagree. But anyway, we go on. She says, it's about replacing our current approach, one obsessed with budget outcomes, with one that prioritizes human outcomes, whatever that means. And she finishes by saying, while at the same time recognizing and respecting our economy's real resource constraints. So for me, when I read that kind of thing, and I don't mean to be overly pejorative, but it's kind of an obfuscation. It's a sort of sophist word sandwich. It's not about removing all limits, but it does seem that way if you look at it. And it's not a free lunch. Well, it seems to be a free lunch for certain people who've got their noses closest to their snouts closest to the trough, the Cantillon effect. It's about, listen to this part, it's about replacing our current approach, one obsessed with budget outcomes, because common sense would suggest, that basic household budgeting idea. It's about replacing our obsession with budget outcomes with one that prioritizes human outcomes. Now, I want to talk about that for 2 seconds as I finish. When I did my first degree many, many years ago, as an undergrad student, I was doing an education degree. We had this teacher come in, this associate professor who ran a semester course, and the number of times he kept saying, we need to do the most human thing. We need to ask what the most human outcome is. And I kept sitting there thinking, what does that actually mean? Because if you want to talk about, prioritizing human outcomes, well, then this is a question of philosophical anthropology. It's a question of ontology, which really is at the heart of most of what animates me in this whole area. Is you can't describe what political economy should be until you have an accurate understanding of the human person. What sort of thing is a person? What leads to human flourishing? So I don't think the MMT people are coming at it from that angle. Prioritizes human outcomes. For me, it's very ethereal. And how would you quantify or qualify that? If you don't have some kind of hard parameters around fiscal policy, but you're prioritizing human outcomes, I think in general it tends to be playing into this whole, Michel Foucault's kind of, this vast victim mentality idea that we're just going to create economies that funnel huge amounts of transfer payments to victim groups or victim classes. I think that's kind of, for me, and I'm really happy to be wrong, and if you think I'm way off, I'd love you to leave a comment. That seems to be what, if I look at the current US political landscape, and this is in June of 2021, that we're seeing this vast transfer, creating a dependent class by using this idea of human outcomes. Anyway, that's just a thought. So friends, let's finish up. What have I learned in Chapter 1? I've learned, according to MMT, I must no longer think of our political overlords as having anything to do with household-style budgeting. Our government is a currency issuer, not a currency user. Therefore, it can print, as long as it's printing and borrowing in its own currency, it has monetary sovereignty and can print and spend forever and ever. Amen. The only limit being inflation. And what else? The tabs and stabs principle, that it's not about taxing and borrowing and then spending, it's about spending first and then taxing and borrowing, and that taxes are used to force us to work without the use of explicit force. Isn't that good news? Isn't that good news next time you get a whopping great tax bill? My accountant emailed me yesterday with my tax bill for the year. Isn't that good that, we get to give them this money in response for them not sending in the jackboots and driving us to work in a gulag? God bless them. So, sorry, I'm being flippant, but you get the point. I'm just interested. I'm genuinely interested in what people think about this. So, friends, that's chapter 1 of Stephanie Kelton's The Deficit Myth, as we all head down the MMT rabbit hole together. So, wherever if you're seeing this, hearing this on YouTube, I'd love you to leave a comment. Otherwise, please come across to the Supply Side podcast at supplysidepartners.com. and leave a comment there. If you like what you're hearing, please post this on social media. Last thing from me, I would love you to become a patron. If you like what you're hearing, and best I can tell, I'm just about the only person on the internet trying to revive a genuine supply-side classical economic discussion. I know there's other accounts and people doing stuff, but I'm trying to bring together many of the best thinkers in the world. So if you want to see this keep happening, please consider supporting me on Patreon. If you just go to patreon.com and do a search for Jonathan Doyle, I would love your help as a supporter of what I'm trying to do. All right, friends, that's it for this episode. Next week, we are going to have Sam Gregg, the research director from the Acton Institute, on. That's going to be fantastic. We have Kirill Sokolov coming on in a couple of days, which is a huge privilege. Really looking forward to that. And then we've got so many good guests coming up. So please make sure you've subscribed. My name is Jonathan Doyle. This has been the Supply Side Podcast. Now get back to work so you can give that tax money back to the government, friends. All right? I've enjoyed doing this. I'm going to have another message for you very soon.